Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: a Chinese national sentenced in the U.S. to 10 years in prison, accused of laundering $62 million in illegal drug money for Mexican cartels. On the Hill, 3 new bipartisan bills aiming to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for fueling the fentanyl crisis in the U.S. China's transnational repression expanding its infiltration to the U.S. Why the CCP is doing that, an expert breaks it down.
The CCP believes it is in an existential struggle with the United States. And it believes it's in an existential struggle, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are.
About 200 people die each day in the U.S. from fentanyl overdoses. Almost all precursors of the deadly drug come from China. But that's not all. In a case this week, U.S. prosecutors said, quote, Chinese money brokers based in Mexico have come to dominate international money laundering markets. And drug money is a big part of the crime. A federal judge in Illinois has sentenced a Chinese national to 10 years in prison. He's accused of laundering $62 million in illegal drug money for Mexican cartels, as much as $3 million a month. Prosecutors say 44-year-old Haiping Pan worked with accomplices to move up to $3 million a month between 2016 and 2018. They used secret money pickups in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. The scheme involved converting U.S. dollars to Chinese yuan and then to Mexican pesos, with funds reaching cartel members. Pan was arrested in Mexico and extradited to the U.S. in 2022. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. 2 co-conspirators have already been sentenced, one to 14 years and another to 5.5 years. Authorities say Pan played a key role due to his financial expertise and connections to Mexican drug traffickers. Prosecutors say the case is part of a recent phenomenon of Chinese money laundering operations based in Mexico. 3 new bipartisan bills in the House aiming to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for fueling the fentanyl crisis in the U.S. A working group within the Select Committee on the CCP says the communist regime is subsidizing the creation of fentanyl's precursor chemicals. Here's NTD correspondent Jason Blair from Capitol Hill.
Yeah, so the working group was very happy to unveil these 3 bipartisan bills. And what they've discovered is that the CCP is subsidizing these chemicals that are needed to make the illicit opioid drug fentanyl. And basically what that means is they are putting tax breaks, they're offering tax breaks to companies that make these drugs. Now, I talked to the committee's chair more about this, and here's what he had to say.
At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is saying that they will cooperate with us to address our drug problem. They're subsidizing companies to make these dangerous chemicals that are shipped into our country. So it really attacks the credibility of the CCP.
And the ranking member, Rep. Krishnamurthy, also said that 97%, the CCP is responsible for exporting 97% of these precursor drugs into the U.S.
Jason, 3 bills all related to the Chinese Communist Party being launched. It's quite incredible. Tell us more about these bills.
Yeah, the working group was very happy to unveil these. They are very proud that they are bipartisan. Let me read the names for these 3 bills real quick. The first one, the Joint Task Force to Counter Illicit Synthetic Narcotics Act, the CCP Fentanyl Sanctions Act, and the International Protection from PRC Fentanyl and Other Synthetic Opioids Act. Now, these bills address a range of areas, including the trafficking aspect and really honing in on the CCP's role in the trafficking process, as well as also the money laundering aspect. And the committee said that these bills are kind of the accumulation of all of their research and investigation throughout 118th Congress, as well as the crucial recommendations from the different people that they have had to come in, the witnesses. And I talked to also Rep. Steele, who is a committee member after their meeting today, and here's her comments on these bills.
These bills that we've been talking about it during the subcommittee meetings, and we brought all the witnesses, and we heard that exactly what was going on. So we've been studying a lot, and this is the start. You know what? Financial institutions, because they are the one actually money laundering, without knowing or not knowing, but something has to be done. So we started this, and these three bills are really important, and it's kind of a warning to China too.
And another thing that Rep. Steele told me is that 200 people a day die in the U.S. from fentanyl poisoning or overdose. And so it's really a very big issue, a growing issue that is a big concern for everybody, a lot of people in the country. And she's said that she's optimistic about the 119th Congress coming in next year, that both houses will be taking this fentanyl issue seriously.
China reacted to the bills, accusing U.S. politicians for, quote, distorting facts and saying the U.S. needs to curb narcotics demand at home. And how exactly is the fentanyl epidemic affecting communities across America? How aware is the public that China is producing most of fentanyl's precursor chemicals? NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear from the people.
How has this fentanyl crisis affected your community?
My community? Well, I'm in Canada, and from Canada, and there's a lot of fentanyl up there as well. Most of it's imported from China. 1 or 2 people are dying every week in my hometown. Every 2 weeks.
We live in Arizona, and it has quite a bit. There's a lot of people suffering from the addiction. Their body just falls apart on them, basically, and they become very isolated. Homeless.
We do see in our community, as Dean was saying, people who are obviously addicted, very malnourished, no teeth.
In my community specifically, I've just seen an increase of people who are without housing, and then I see a lot of them like asking for resources and asking for support.
Most of the fentanyl precursors came from China. So, so how are you reacting to this information?
It's so easy, like to import it because it's like such a small amount. They can put it in a letter and mail it.
Pause, great pause. I'm so busy dealing with the consequences of it, I don't oftentimes get to deal with that particular root of it.
Well, that's news to me, but I try real hard not to pay attention to news these days because I find it disturbing. I feel that most of the animosity that we're aiming at Mexico is very misplaced. I had no idea that it was coming from China.
China seems to be sending the drugs in through Mexico. That seems to be a major issue for the southern regions that are all along the border.
Members of Congress are increasingly bringing up the Chinese Communist Party's transnational repression, or silencing and harassment of dissidents overseas. It's a tactic the Chinese regime has used for decades, and we're still seeing it here in the U.S. Here to discuss is China expert and author Gordon Chang.
Now, transnational repression, it's a term we're hearing more and more on Capitol Hill recently, especially with regard to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this idea is explained in your latest book, Plan Red. Can you just describe for us what it is and what it looks like right now?
What Beijing is doing is it's trying to impose its views on the world, and we see this across the board. So, for instance, China is sending its agents throughout the United States, demanding that people not criticize China. We see they're sending their agents to force people back to Beijing. Beijing basically doesn't believe that there are any limits to its laws. And this has been going on for some time. The problem is that American presidents have known that Chinese consular officials and diplomats have been violating American sovereignty, and they've done very little about it. So the Chinese have just continued it. And now they felt brazen enough to open up police stations in our country. Yes, the FBI closed one in New York City, but nonetheless, both the Daily Caller and the New York Post says there are at least 7 to 9 more Chinese police stations on U.S. soil.
Now, how does the CCP perceive America, and what are its objectives in terms of undermining America?
Well, the CCP believes it is in an existential struggle with the United States. And it believes it's in an existential struggle, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. An insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of America's values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So it does not believe it will be safe as long as the United States exists, which means that there's only going to be one survivor. It's either going to be the People's Republic of China or the United States of America, not both. But also you got to remember that the CCP, especially under Xi Jinping, has been promoting this notion that Chinese rulers have not only the right but the obligation to rule what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven, which means they believe they're the world's only legitimate state. And to make this even worse, since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory.
Well, one of the CCP's biggest targets of this transnational repression in America and around the globe is Falun Gong. America has freedom of belief. How has China been subverting American society and trying to attack this group from within America?
There is evidence that the Chinese regime has been spreading misinformation, lies about Falun Gong, and it has been working through institutions that it has corrupted to make it difficult for Falun Gong to operate in the U.S. This has been going on ever since the persecution began, and it'll continue as long as the Communist Party exists.
Now, last week, the House passed a bipartisan Shield Against CCP Act. It's a bill that would require Homeland Security to have a working group dedicated to identifying threats from Beijing. Now, here's New York Congressman Tom Suozzi discussing the CCP's role in manipulating public discourse.
They promote the most extreme sides of our thorniest debates, whether it's Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, or transgender versus evangelicals, or Israel versus Gaza. The Chinese Communist Party promotes the most extreme positions on both sides of the debate, not with the objective of winning a debate, but fomenting dissent in America.
Gordon, how important is this legislation, and what more can be done to enhance national security?
I know that it's not politically popular, but what is necessary is for us to remove all contacts of the Chinese regime with the United States. They use every point of contact to overwhelm our society in the way you just described and also in other ways. And right now, our federal government is overwhelmed. Law enforcement is overwhelmed. Our academic institutions are overwhelmed. Our businesses are overwhelmed. And we are not going to survive as an independent, sovereign state until we remove those contacts, until we can figure out how to deal with this. But right now, we're not. And China is extremely influential and is getting its way in the highest councils of the American government.
One of the ways that they're influencing is through the sister cities relationship. Washington, D.C. has maintained a sister city relationship with Beijing since 1984. Congressman John Molinar expressed concern to D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser.
I don't think you would have had a sister city relationship with Berlin during Nazi Germany. I think those are fair assumptions. I guess the question I would ask for you and the council to consider is, are Beijing's actions consistent with what should be our nation's capital and a sister city relationship?
Gordon, how concerning is it for an American city to pursue this level of engagement with China?
Yeah, China uses sister city relationships to try to subvert governments in the U.S., and they do it by promises of friendship, promises of investment, all sorts of things. And I think that, yes, it would be good if cities on their own would terminate these relationships, but that's probably not going to happen. So what we need is the President of the United States using his emergency powers to sever that. And to make this more permanent, we need congressional legislation just to outlaw these relationships.
Gordon, anything else to add here on the issue of transnational repression?
We know that the Communist Party believes that unless it controls other countries, it will not be safe and secure itself. So it's not like the Chinese will just repress their own people. This is a regime which believes it must rule the world. And we have to remember, we have to listen to what it says. You know, in May 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, carried a landmark editorial that declared a people's war on us. Now, we're Americans, so we think we can ignore what our enemies say. But they're creating, I think, a justification with its strident anti-Americanism. They're creating a justification to strike our country. We have to be prepared. We've got to cut these links.
Gordon Chang, thank you very much for your insight here today.
Thank you.
Coming up, a sluggish economy in China. Retail giant Alibaba is selling its department store business there and taking a $1 billion loss in the process. The U.S. and its allies are boosting their efforts in the space race. Is China catching up? A tightrope for the UK, money and security. The UK wants both when dealing with China. Is this possible? More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. China's economy is in a sluggish condition. Chinese retail giant Alibaba is now selling its department store business there. This comes as the Chinese people are becoming more and more reluctant to spend money.
Alibaba selling its in-time department store chain and booking a $1.3 billion loss to do so. The Chinese giant bought the company for twice that amount back in 2017. At the time, it wanted to expand into bricks and mortar retail. Now Alibaba is taking a hit as it speeds up restructuring process, aiming to focus on its core e-commerce business. Weak Chinese consumer spending has also put stores of all kinds under pressure. Alibaba is selling in time to a consortium made up of China-based clothing makers. It may also look to sell other consumer sector assets, including grocery business Fresh Hippo.
The moon, a new frontier in the race between the U.S. and China. As an ascending space power, China has been working hard to expand its influence beyond Earth. Both nations are now vying for global partners to join their missions to the moon. U.S. ally Australia has selected a team to build its first ever lunar rover, which will be working with NASA. The Australian government has picked a consortium of 21 companies to start working on the rover for their space agency.
The federal government is allocating the equivalent of around $26 million for the rover. Dubbed Rover, the semi-autonomous should land on the moon later this decade to collect lunar soil. The ultimate goal is to work with NASA to find a way to establish a sustainable human presence on the moon. The 21 companies, known collectively as ELO2, say it's a privilege to be trusted with this mission.
Earlier this week, NASA announced new delays in the U.S.'s program to return astronauts to the moon. It's been pushed back to April 2026. China plans to put astronauts on the moon by 2030. Money and security. The UK wants both when dealing with China. A tightrope for the U.S. ally. Britain's Chancellor says national security comes first, but adds it's in the UK's interest to trade with China. This follows reports of alleged Chinese spies in Britain and pressure to adopt a tougher stance on China. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more on this from London.
Recent reports of 2 alleged Chinese spies have put pressure on the British government to adopt a tougher stance on the Chinese regime. But the government has so far been reluctant to do so, with British Chancellor Rachel Reeves saying it's in the UK's national interest to have a pragmatic relationship with China.
And so, of course, to challenge where appropriate and to ensure that our national security is protected. But like other countries around the world, we should trade and seek investment when it is in our national interest to do so, and that will be the approach of this government.
The British government plans to bring in a register designed to tackle foreign influence, but it won't be put in place until summer 2025. Nor is it clear yet whether the government will put China in the enhanced tier, which would require a broader range of activities to be covered due to security concerns. Such a move could damage business relations with China at a time when the government is seeking a better relationship with Beijing. Reeves is expected to visit China in the new year for talks. It comes after Prime Minister Keir Starmer's meeting with Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping in November. The renewed focus on the government's China approach follows 2 recent and prominent alleged spy cases. That of Yang Tembo, a Chinese businessman who forged close ties with Prince Andrew and senior politicians, who lost his appeal case against being banned from entering the UK on national security grounds. And of lawyer Christine Lee, who British security services warned had engaged in political interference and activities for a branch of the Chinese Communist Party. Both Yang Tenbo and Christine Li are believed to have worked with the CCP's United Front Work Department. Xi Jinping has described the United Front as a magic weapon to bolster Beijing's reach abroad, smoothing the way for the CCP's interests while also neutralizing threats to China's power. British politician Ian Duncan Smith recently said there were 40,000 members of the United Front who had penetrated every sector of the UK economy and called on the British government to put China on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
A survey on Tuesday shows German business morale is getting worse than expected. It comes after German car companies are losing market shares in China.
German car companies also have problems with IT, and the importance of IT is growing. And German car companies have not been very good in this area, which is why they are losing their market shares, especially in China.
Last week, 3 German automakers saw their quarterly sales plunge in China. Consumer demand remains weak, and competition from local electric cars is fierce. BMW saw its biggest decline in sales in over 4 years, a 30% drop. Mercedes sales fell 13%, while Porsche's sales in China plunged 19%. Two of Japan's biggest car makers, Honda and Nissan, are struggling in China as well, so much so that these two rivals are now discussing a merger. Nissan stopped production at one of its plants in China. Honda also cut its workforce at its joint venture in China. That's as competition from Chinese EV makers and Tesla are getting more intense. Zooming in on the Russia-Ukraine war, the Pentagon said on Monday that North Korean troops have been killed in combat against Ukraine for the first time. The Biden administration didn't specify how many were killed or injured. But Ukraine said 30 North Korean troops were killed or injured over the weekend close to the border. Both the U.S. and Ukraine believe that about 12,000 North Korean soldiers are fighting for Russia. That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. Coming up on NTD, stay tuned for America's Hope with Kelly Wright. Kelly talks with actor Bailey Chase, who stars in the post-apocalyptic film Homestead, produced by Angel Studios. The film, set for release on December 20th, explores themes of family, protection, and hope in a dystopian world. And from the world of Broadway, Kevin Davis, an off-Broadway producer and director, about his musical 1 in a Million, which received a nomination from Broadway World as Best Off-Broadway Musical. Watch America's Hope tonight at 10 p.m. after China in Focus. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.